All right, all
Let's
good.
go.
Let's dive in. So I'd like to begin with what I believe is the foundation of great leadership, and that's values. And if there are any M&M fans in the audience, this is one of the quotes from his song Lose Yourself, which I love. It came out in 2003 when I was doing my weapons school. And that is exactly how I felt before taking command. It was my one shot. I didn't want to mess it up. Not for me, not for the people that were going to be relying on me. So I did what every good fighter pilot does. I prepared. And spoiler alert, being prepared is going to be a recurrent theme in the webinar. So, armed with a couple of books on leadership, a solid plan, and a few honest conversations with my coach, which happened to be my wife, which is also in the webinar, I started my command tour. And even if I have to say so myself, it went really well. And not because I had all the answers, but because I had taken the time to deeply think about who I wanted to be as a leader and who the squadron was as a team. So I basically thought a lot about core values, and that is what I want to start with today. This is a picture of a formation of T-38s from Shepherd Air Force Base. That's where we train our future fighter pilots. I chose that picture because when we train the next generation of pilots, we don't just focus on teaching them flying skills, we also teach them attitude and values that will make sure that we turn them into great fighter pilots and later on great leaders. So I'm curious if you can guess what two of the most important values could be for fighter pilots. So don't hesitate, take a guess, type it in the chat. I'll take a look later on. So
I'm having a look at the chat, Steph, so I can tell
sounds
when
good.
things come in. I'm really curious what people will say. What do you guys think are the most important values?
Back to leadership and values. So it's really important to realize that leadership is not just about delivering results. It's also about knowing who you are and what guides you. Why? Well, because values is what you will be falling back on when the pressure hits. And you probably have heard that quote, but being a leader is about doing the right thing, not just doing things right. It's a very subtle, but very profound difference. Doing things right means basically doing everything by the procedures, by the books, and sometimes without even questioning the morality, the ethics, or the strategic implications. But in times of crisis, through leaders, sometimes you're required the courage to step outside of the script and do what's right. And to do that, you need to be firmly grounded in your values. They are your compass when the rules fail. And to be honest, that level of clarity, it just doesn't come by accident. It requires intentional reflection. So for me, my values were integrity, respect, and empowering others. I was often complimented on the part about respect, because even though sometimes as a squadron commander I had to be strict, I always treated everybody in the squadron with respect and dignity. And it's a value that I had deeply internalized. So it was not really about how I addressed people, but it was also about what I didn't say, about my body language, and about the energy that I would reflect, so that people really felt that the respect I had for them was genuine. On the other hand, even though to me, empowering others was really important because I really hate micromanaging bosses, Initially, I didn't do a great job at it. Often I would go into meetings with, what are the subject matter expert, the fighter pilots. And because at the time I still thought that I had, in certain domains at least, still had some expertise, or at least I thought so. I would come into a meeting or a working group with already preconceived ideas. I would intentionally or unintentionally, I would orient the discussion, and more often than not, we would actually implement my ideas, which, it's hardly empowering others, right? But fortunately for me, and my fighter pilot friends in the audience will attest to that, is that fighter pilots, we have a very strong feedback culture. We call it debriefing. We don't sugarcoat it, and we tell it like it is, irrespective of rank. And I was fortunate enough to have some of my pilots give me that honest feedback at the beginning of my tour as a squadron commander. So I was kind of able to still realign and really empower people. All right, let's take a look at the chat. What I've got: integrity, respect, humility, discipline. Awesome. Well, honesty. I think you're pretty close to trust, care, teamwork, integrity. I think we're very close to what they are, to me at least. I was an instructor at Shepherd Air Force Base as well. It's integrity, honesty, and humility. And why are we so strict on those values? Because as fighter pilots, we need to be able to trust one another, especially if you're going to be flying into combat together. It has to be blind trust. All right, great. So far, we've talked about personal values. Now I'm going to talk about the values of the team as well, because that too is very important. So right after I took command, I led the squadron through an exercise to define our shared values. Now, values, it's not something you can impose from top down. Why would people suddenly internalize my values because I'm the squadron commander? It definitely doesn't work like that. So in a team, values need to be shaped from the bottom up through discussion, dialogues, reflection, and more importantly, shared ownership. But this being said, it's not a free-for-all game, because as a leader, I still had to guide the exercise, because I had to make sure that the values we come up with fitted within the larger expectations of my organization, namely the Air Force. So as a squadron, we chose following core values: respect, team spirit, and professionalism. And these became our anchor, our identity. Now, it didn't mean that I was aiming for conformity. I still deeply valued diversity of thought and opinion. But to build real trust, people need to feel part of something bigger than themselves, a shared community with a common foundation. And that sense of belonging becomes especially important when you're going to be deploying with these people to places that are, well, let's say, less than hospitable. And having those shared values also gave me the foundation to hold people accountable, and not from a top-down controlling way, but in a way that felt fair, aligned, and more importantly, with what we had all agreed on. So it worked really, really well. And we did create a very tight-knit group in the squadron. So I would offer up to you, before next time you dive into strategy, KPIs, performance matrix, just think about, what do I stand for? What do we stand for? What do you think, Sabine?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Stephane. I think from experience, I've seen that in business, we tend to undervalue taking the time to stop and think about these topics. I'm convinced that if I had to go out into the business world today and ask 10 leaders, tell me, what are your top 3 non-negotiable leadership values, and how do you demonstrate those in your day-to-day behaviors? I'm telling you, I'm quite convinced very few would be able to give me a clear, substantial answer. And this is actually where I start the coaching work that I do with leaders. I help them get clear on who they want to be as leaders. And I actually read a quote today, which fits so perfectly into our workshop. And it said, it's as important to know who you don't want to be as it is to know who you want to be. So let me show you the model that I use for this first conversation, because I think it will give you some food for thought over the coming weeks as well. So there's a famous quote by Mark Twain that says, the 2 most important days in your life are the day you were born and the day you find out why. And working with leaders to help them become the best leader they can be always starts for me with the question, who do you want to be as a leader? So how do you develop the strong, clear sense of self, which is really crucial, because if you don't know what you stand for, you will struggle to hold your ground when you have to make difficult, nuanced business decisions. And in business, most decisions are nuanced. So let me show you how I talk people through it. The first exercise I have them do is to get clear on their values. Think of 3. We have a list that I have, which has been compiled worldwide, of about 128 values that are commonly recognized as always present in organizations. And I help leaders first select 10, then 5, then wheedle it down to the 3 that you will show up for every day. Get clear on those. The second thing is write down for yourself, what do you want your leadership legacy to be? And I notice from experience, leaders struggle with this when I ask them that question. And I always have to say, not when you're dead, when you leave a room, when you leave a meeting, when you leave a company, what do you want people to remember about you as a leader? Write that down for yourself, 2-3 sentences. Nobody has to see it. And then finally, the third V is your values. Your voice. Learn to speak about your values. Your values are of no use to anyone but yourself if you don't talk about them. So you need to learn and find ways to talk to your team about them, so that people know what you stand for, what they can expect of you, and also what you expect of them. But of course, having this clear is only really the beginning. Once you're clear on this first part, the next question is, well, how am I going to demonstrate those values? How will people know that this is what I stand for? And even more importantly, how will I make them measurable? To the point that Steph said, once you've got your leadership values clear, you then build team values with your team. But then what? What happens then? So let me give you an example. Let's say one of your values is transparency. You could then say, okay, an operating principle for me would be to honor that value. I will make sure that every decision I'm going to take, I'm going to share with people for input before I finalize it, because that's my value of transparency in action. And then you could measure that by asking people and your leadership team feedback once a quarter. How involved did you feel in in decisions? How transparent did you think I was? So this is how you can operationalize your values into your team. And then finally, I want to leave you with one more food for thought, which I also tackle when I work with leaders, and that is this. How will you handle conflicting values? For instance, if one of your values is transparency, what are you going to do in a situation that requires discretion? It's important to think about those concepts so that when you do get into those situations, you know what you want to do. To Steph's point, to be prepared. And that takes me to this slide, which is the lessons we want to leave business leaders with. I've already said it. A strong core is non-negotiable. You need to know what you stand for. The second one is people will do what you do, not what you say. So your leadership is only as strong as your convictions. And then, as I mentioned, learn to speak about your values. For example, one of my leadership values is courage. So I expect myself to be able to have difficult conversations or to hear feedback which may not be comfortable to me. My team knows this. I speak to them about it. And I often use the sentence, please challenge me if you disagree, to honor that value of courage. Equally, I expect courage from my team, and I explain to them why courage is important to me. I explain to them that courage is what helps us challenge the status quo or challenge each other respectfully and constructively, and that's how we grow, that's how we learn, and that's how we innovate. And then finally, Steph said it as well, keep people accountable for the mindsets and the behaviors that you expect of them. Define your team values together and then role model them as a leader to keep people and the team as a whole accountable to demonstrate that. This brings us to the end of this first section. There are 3 sections. We have time at the end of every section for 2 or 3 questions. Are there any reflections or questions from the audience on the topic of values? Please feel free to speak up, or if you're more comfortable to put it in the chat, that's fine too. Oh. Any questions or reflections? How do you quantify a value as respect? Oh, wow. What an interesting one. Gunther, you're drawing on our screen. Welcome. Steph, do you want to go first? The question is, how do you quantify a value as respect? Or how do you check the value? Any thoughts?
I would say quantified, that would be a pretty tough one, but you would at least you know you've hit the nail if you have a open communication within your team or your organization. That means that, I mean, if people do not feel respected, there's no way they're going to be open to you. They're going to be providing your feedback. As well, I think it's, again, very difficult to measure, but there's so much unspoken as well, right? It's about body language, and you, if you do pay attention to it, you will see how people are reacting to you, if they're confident, if they, you know.
I can add to that, Steph. In business, there is a company called Barrett's Values Assessment, Barrett's Value Center, I think they're called now, and they actually measure how values are displayed in companies. And they have this survey that asks 3 questions, which are your top 10 values. So there you indicate what's important to you. The next question is, which are the values that you see displayed most often in a company? Respect will be on that list. If respect is not mentioned in the top 10 that people see in the company, then we know that it's not being displayed. So we quantify it as not visible. The third question the survey asks is, what values do you think need to be displayed more of in order for this organization to reach its maximum potential? If respect is on there and it wasn't on the second question, then you know there's a problem with respect.
Yeah, that's a good one. And I would also say is that I mean, most of us probably have kids, and as you know, kids learn way more from mimicking our behavior than actually what we're telling them. So you will also notice it's your behavior will have an impact on the team. And if you see interactions between 2 different team members not being respectful, that's a red light already coming up that there's an issue within the team about respect. And it all starts with your interactions with individuals, because they will mimic your behavior.
Steph, we have a question. We have a couple of questions. The first one is, which I think is really interesting, from Sjoerd. Were you ever challenged on your values by a team member? And if so, how did you handle that?
Yes, as I mentioned, and I was really fortunate that I was challenged. To me, it was super important to empower others. But actually, it was well intended, but I didn't. And I was just fortunate because that is, and I really mean it, fortunate, because it is really hard as a leader to get feedback. There's a natural resistance for people to come up to their boss and say like, well, it's blah blah, but actually in reality you're not empowering us because you always come up with your ideas. So creating this environment where it's totally okay to give feedback, where you actually foster a small amount of dissent, it's good. We all need a couple of rebels in our team. Those are the people that will give you the hard truth. So if we crush that, that is really, really bad.
Steph, can I ask you a second question
Or
from Gunther? Do you consider everyone in a company as a possible leader, all colors, and so do you implement such trainings in all divisions? I'm sure we have complementary answers on that. I'd love to hear a very short one from you, and then I'll also give my perspective on it.
so I think this is a very personal opinion. I don't think leading is for everybody. So I think it takes a certain personality. It takes the will to want to do it. And then, of course, you can train to specific skills. But I'm not sure that it's a good fit for all personalities. And I'm really not talking about being an extrovert or an introvert, because I'm not really an extrovert, but I really enjoyed my time as a commander. But there was a deep drive of wanting to do it, trying to do it right, and it's really trying to as well understand that it's not about you when you're in that position. It's really about the team. So it really takes a certain personality, but definitely takes a certain will to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree, Steph. And if I transfer that to organizations, I would add another layer to that. I think you have different types of leaders in an organization. You have formal leaders and informal leaders. Formal leaders are the people that have the titles and the functions to lead other people. And informal leaders can be in leadership functions, but very often are not. They're the people who are naturally charismatic, who influence others, who are strong collaborators. And to your question, Gunther, I think we do need to try and get the leadership potential in people across all levels of the organization to the surface, but that doesn't necessarily, to Steph's point, I agree with him, translate into everyone is made to have a formal leadership function. But you can get that informal leadership potential out of people. You can give them skills to collaborate better, communicate better, influence, all these things, resolve conflict, all leadership skills which are very necessary, but don't necessarily get them into formal leadership positions. Mindful of time, Steph.
Absolutely.
Shall we move on to the second section?
Absolutely. Here we go.
Perfect. Thank you. 1 second. Let me also move my slides so I can see them. Super. We're going to talk about culture, one of my favorite topics. Some of you may have heard the famous quote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And I'm a firm believer that this is true. I've been involved in my career in many strategic projects, from making a merger work to helping a leadership team prepare a strategy shifts. That means they need to let 10 or 20% of their people go. And I know from experience that you can have all the fancy decks and the minutely worked out roadmaps for implementation. But if your leaders don't trust each other, or if your people managers grumble and don't support the change, or if your people work in silos, then none of that matters anymore. And I always tell people, culture isn't part of the game, it is the game. So a lot of the work that I do in organizations is around assessing their culture, to the point that you had, Gunther, about, or someone said it, it was Shurt, I think, who said, you know, can you challenge people? How can you measure values? Culture is a very broad topic, and values is part of culture, and it has many aspects. So we can look at a company's leadership culture, or we can look at its feedback culture, its risk culture, or its collaboration culture. But for the sake of today's session, we've taken one aspect of culture, which I think is not widely known in the corporate world, and which we wanted to share with you here, because I think it was interesting for me to learn, and it will be interesting, I think, for you to learn as well. And that's the concept of just culture. So, Steph, do you want to talk us through?
Absolutely. So back in 2016, I was commanding a detachment. We were in Jordan, and we were conducting operations over Iraq and Syria. And one afternoon, I'm in my office and I'm getting a call. I pick up the phone. It's like, hey, sir, we've had an accident on the flight line. One of the GBU-38s fell off a loading cart. So what's a GBU-38? That's the weapon you're seeing on the picture on the right-hand side. It is a 250-kilogram bomb with a GPS guidance in the tail kit, so and the aft part of the weapon. So of course, my immediate reaction was like, okay, let's make sure we secure the area, sure everybody's safe, check if there's any injuries. Fortunately, nobody got hurt. Then I asked for a quick assessment. All right, what's the damage? What exactly happened? Report came back, and it's like, okay, the bomb fell off the loading truck, the tail kit is damaged beyond repair, and it looks like it's most likely due to negligence from the loading crew. So now, once I was back in my office by myself, I'll be honest, I cursed a lot. All right, those tail kits are extremely expensive. They're about $30,000 a piece. And at the times, we were actually running short of them. And then to hear that it was most likely due to negligence, I can tell you my gut instinct was to assign blame. Point finger at the loading crew. It just felt natural. It felt automatic. But here's the kicker. What behavior would I trigger if I jumped to conclusion and blamed the loading crew? So if there's an error that's being done, if I start blaming people, what behavior am I going to motivate? Basically, the next time people are making a mistake, they're going to hide their mistakes. I'm going to reinforce cover your ass behavior, which means I'm not going to be able to trust people. If I'm not trusting people, I'm going to hoard authority. I'm not going to be delegating authority. So really bad things, right? Additionally, we've not learned from our mistake. Why did we make the mistake? So it means if there's any systemic problems, we are not fixing them. So we'll just keep repeating them. And we'll be stuck in that cycle. And I mean, at least in our business, got kind of a rule of thumb that, you know, if you have about 30 really minor incidents, that's going to be leading most likely to a major incident. And if you've got 30 of those major incidents, you're on your way to having a major accident. So the whole point is to break this cycle, because otherwise you are heading to a catastrophic event. In our case, that's a crash. And that's going to lead to worst case fatalities, best case, tarnish your reputation. So fortunately for me, my Air Force in the 90s stepped away from a culture of blame and walk towards a culture of what we call a just culture.
Mm.
So what is a just culture? Is a specific approach to human error. The whole point of it is that it is based on root cause analysis. We're going to try to dig as deep as possible to find what was the exact cause of the error. And really important is that it's focused on the system, not the people. Why? Because we want to improve our processes. People will make mistakes, but we want to make sure that we set up a system that is as fail-safe as possible. And the thing I love the most about the just culture is that it is not a laissez-faire culture. If you listen to this the first time, it's like, oh, okay, so it's the opposite. There's no blame whatsoever. No, absolutely not. The strength of the just culture is that it really clearly draws the line between acceptable and non-acceptable behavior. So I'll walk you through it's a simplified flow chart just to show you how we think about human errors in a just culture approach. The first question I'm going to ask myself when something happened is, was the task clearly understood? If the answer is no, we're talking about an individual error. So it's most likely not to blame the person. I need to look back at how did I train that individual? Now, if the task was clearly understood, then I'm going to be looking at the circumstances. How were the circumstances? Were all the tools available for the person? Did he get enough rest? All these kind of things. If the answer is no, I have a systemic problem. I need to be looking at my resources. I need to adapt the resources available. But if the circumstances are right, the next question I'm going to ask myself is, was there an intentional deviation from procedures? And the key word here is intentional. If the answer is no, well, it means that we either followed the procedure or a deviation was not intentional. So it basically means that either I don't have procedures written down or they're really poorly documented. So that's where I need to look at. So it's again a systemic error. Finally, if now there is an intentional deviation from the procedure, now I'm going to be looking at what was the motivation of the individual. And there's two major paths we can walk to now. Was it mission-centric or was it person-centric? Mission-centric means, right, the individual deliberately stepped away from procedure, but it was for the good of the service. He's trying to achieve the objectives we're going after. Person-centric is basically he's cutting corners, trying to have a shorter day, trying to go to the gym sooner. That's it. So here, in both cases, we have a problem of supervision, culture, or attitude on the individual. And last is that you can have a malevolent act. So intentional deviation from procedures, it's basically sabotage. So now you have a security concern. So when I look at that, I can really draw the line where acceptable and non-acceptable behavior. It basically boils down to if you intentionally deviate from the rules, the procedures, as long as it's mission-centric, that is still acceptable. If it's person-centric, that is not acceptable. And that's where you should have consequences. So if I kind of look back at this flow chart and I now think about the accident with the weapon, let's go through it together. So the loading crew, that's 2 person, and believe it or not, but one of them was actually the person responsible to train all the other loading crews at my airbase. So he definitely knew and understood the task. It happened during the daytime. They were well rested. They had a normal workday, so no long hours. All the tools were available, so conditions were adequate. The procedures are very well documented. We have the checklist for all of these procedures, so no issues there. However, what happened is that they did some of the steps by memory. They did not back themselves up with the checklist, which is a requirement. And that is what resulted in some steps being missed, weapon not being secured properly, and the accident. So obviously, procedure requires them to use a checklist. So the question is really now, why did they intentionally deviate from the procedures, namely not using the checklist? So that's, you're kind of digging through an investigation, and there was no sign, at least we could find, that there was any indication that they did it for personal gain. They didn't want to get off duty sooner whatsoever. What could have played a role is that they perceived that there was some time pressure, because we only had, at the time, we only had 2 loading crews, we had 6 airplanes, a lot of configuration changes that needed to happen, and it all needed to happen before the night flight that was coming. So some time pressure maybe. But what we did find out as well was that, and that was the most concerning part, the investigation found that there was actually a deviation from norms by all the loading crew. It had become acceptable for some of them to rely on memory and not on checklists. So kind of looking back at the accidents, is we didn't have a problem of just one loading crew not doing their job correctly. We had a way bigger issue about supervision, culture, and attitude. So how did we address it? Well, first of all, we had to address a deviation of norm by briefing, sensibilizing all the loading crews. Then we actually had to review as well supervision, because obviously at some point it broke down. We'll look back at that. And sure, there was some time constraint, but it was never to the extent that it warranted cutting corners. So we also had to address that, like, hey, why did you guys think you have a time pressure? Or so we actually looked back at, like, hey, how do we communicate between maintenance personnel and operational personnel to make sure that there's not this incorrect perception, or if it is a pressure, that at least ops knows as well. And finally, believe it or not, but we also had to take care of the loading crew that caused the accident, because they were pretty shook up. They felt terrible. They felt guilt. They felt shit, bottom line. So this would have been a very, very easy moment to completely crush them. But that would have been no good at all. So instead of blaming them, we actually supported them, we coached them, and we told them, like, hey, this is actually a great opportunity for them to reinforce our adjust culture by openly debriefing this accident to all the other loading crews. And so that is, in a nutshell, how we go about treating accidents in a just culture. But I'll leave the floor now to Sabine, because when we talk to culture and changing culture, that is much easier said than done.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think the first thing I want to talk about is timing. Steph mentioned it as well. Culture change takes time. It's not an event. Often people will come to me and say, we want to change our culture. What can we do? As if it's a light switch that we're going to flick, but it's not. It takes time. And the timing itself is crucial. So culture change needs a favorable environment to succeed. So for example, don't do a culture change 6 months before you're going to implement a new strategy. Don't start a culture change program, or don't start a culture change program if you know that 3 or 6 months from now, you're going to have to lay off people. Make sure that if you do invest time in changing your culture, that the environment supports that as well. The second thing I want to mention is leadership. Research has shown, and I've seen it with my own eyes, that a leader determines the culture, period. What the leader tolerates, the lowest level of behavior that the leader tolerates, defines the culture. What the leader role models in terms of positive behavior defines the highest aspiration of the culture. So that's how the bandwidth is created. So leaders are super important in creating culture. And then something that we often forget in culture, we think, yeah, but culture is fluffy, you can't measure it. Actually, culture is very measurable. What I've often seen is that companies aspire to a certain culture. Let's, for instance, say, we want a very collaborative, agile culture. But then when I look at the structures that they have in place, the processes, the information flows, the recognition and reward mechanisms, they all don't support an agile collaborative culture. So you actually have to go look at all those things. You know, who has access to information? What do we reward? Are our processes in support of the culture that we want? Do our structures support or hinder the culture that we want? So culture becomes very measurable in how it's operationalized. And then finally, communication. Changing culture is about explaining the why. And often when I work with leadership teams around strategy changes and culture changes, which are part of that, the message that I hear, or the thing CEOs say to me most often is, but don't they understand it yet? And then I always have to go, well, you've been working on it for 6 months with your leadership team, but you've only explained it in one town hall, and no, that is not enough. You need to keep repeating what you want people to understand, the why of why you want this culture, why it's important, why you want them to behave in a certain way, and saying it once or twice in a town hall is not enough. And that brings us to the end of this section, which is the lessons we want to leave you with. And that's this. Every company has a culture, and it's either by design or it's by default. So either you design it and build it the way you want, or if it's by default, that means you ignore it and you let people create it themselves along the way. And that's how often you get to really shitty cultures as well. A leader's mindset and behavior defines the culture. I'll give you 2 very different examples. Elon Musk, SpaceX. He created a high-pressure, mission-driven, innovation at all costs culture. Paul Polman, ex-Unilever CEO, on the other hand, completely different CEO. He was focused on sustainability. He was all about collaboration. That's what was important to him. The lesson for both these leaders is the same. Every decision both of them make will either strengthen or weaken the culture they want to create. So my question to you today is, the behavior that you demonstrate, the decisions that you make, are they reinforcing the culture you want to create in your team or in your organization? And if not, you need to adjust. The third thing is trust. Trust is everything. Steph said it. I'm a firm believer of it myself. Patrick Lencioni's work speaks to it. Trust is the foundation of a healthy team and a healthy company. It enables open communication, psychological safety, collaboration. And really, without trust, what do we see in organizations? That everything happens that they don't want. Innovation stalls, accountability fades, people hold back their best thinking. So as Steph said, blame really does prevent learning and growth. And then the fourth point is track culture. Culture isn't fluffy like many people think. It's measurable. I've just said it. So ask yourself the question, how do the structures, roles, responsibilities, processes support or hinder the culture that we want to create? Our KPIs, our performance metrics, what do we incentivize? Does that all support the culture we want to create? And then what are psychological safety scores or our innovation metrics? How many new ideas have we implemented lately? That will give you a good sense of how safe and trustworthy people feel. And then finally, Steph said it, repetition is key. Culture is everyone's job. It's not just the leader's job, it's everyone's job. But culture is about accountability and ownership, not about punishment. So fear doesn't work. It's about having people feel responsible for outcomes without fear. So that's this section. Are there any questions on culture or reflections? before we go into our last section today, which is making decisions under pressure? Good. All righty.
Shall I continue?
Yes.
All right, perfect. We'll talk about, like Sabine said now, making decisions under pressure. All right, so picture this. You're sitting with your wingman in a dusty little shed in Afghanistan. You're on standby. Your task is to support ground troops in case they come under fire. It's the middle of the night. You're tired. You start to doze off, trying to catch some rest. And then boom, the alarm bell goes off. You got 15 to 30 minutes to grab your gear, grab your mission material, get airborne in the middle of the night, because somewhere out there, life depends on you. Together with your wingman, you blast off in the middle of the night. You don't even know yet where you're going to go. You'll get all the details, the situation update as you're traveling towards the target. So you can imagine the stress, the emotions you go through during one of those scrambles. So now ask yourself, how well do you think when you're under pressure? And the truth is, stress messes with our minds, right? We don't think clearly. We miss our blind spots. We rush. We assume. And in my world, assumptions can kill. Not exactly the best mindset when you're out there and your responsibility is to protect lives. So, how do fighter pilots deal with that? Well, we prepare and we always have backup. By default, fighter pilots, we're contingency planners. We always think, hey, what if this and this could happen? And we always do that before we're put in the situation, because obviously in a fighter jet, you're moving at a reasonable speed. So before a crisis hits, we do a lot of contingency planning. And we document it. It's basically a lot of checklists we have, and we practice them. And we always have somebody double check or challenge our decision. That's our wingman. And believe it or not, I mentioned rebels, but in a fighter pilot culture, we actually encourage dissent, which is very counterintuitive in the military, where most people think it's very strict, hierarchical. No, we do. And in flight, rank does not matter. So back to our scramble. One of the missions I actually flew in Afghanistan out of such a situation was a CASEVAC, which stands for casualty evacuation. So what happens is a vehicle hit a roadside bomb, soldiers were injured, and a helicopter had been called in to evacuate the wounded soldiers. Our task was to go out there and secure the perimeter for the helicopter. So basically we would be scanning and see if we pick up any hostile activity around the landing zone of the helicopter. And I can tell you, in one of those situations, you definitely don't think clearly. I felt sad, but I mostly felt angry for what just had happened to those soldiers. And anger leads to impulsivity, and that leads to actively trying to find somebody to blame. There's not a good path in this situation. So very easy to fall prey to confirmation bias. If you're looking for something, you want to find something, you want to find enemy activity, well, guess what? You're going to find it. And once your mind has taken that path, anchoring bias kicks in, and now it's really hard to accept new information that contradicts your initial thoughts. So how do we cope with that in the cockpit? Well, first of all, we are aware of our shortcomings. So we rely a lot on procedures, steps, checklists. And like I said again, is that we also rely on somebody else. And that's our wingman. So we're never going to take a drastic decision without having the wingman challenge our decision first. Fortunately, that night, there was no ambush, and the helicopter was able to evacuate the wounded soldiers. So what did I learn from that, and what lessons did I apply for my job as a squadron commander? Well, first of all, it's all about being prepared. Preparation is key. It's half the battle. And step one I would offer to you is choose wisely who you surround yourself with. To me, that kind of meant like composing my command team. Who were the couple of people I would surround myself with, and the people I trusted and I wanted to have them challenge me during my decisions, right? My ops officer, my executive officer, my senior master sergeant, people like that. And I made sure that I surrounded myself with people who had the same values as me, but very different backgrounds, different expertise, and different viewpoints. Because what I wanted to avoid was group thinking. Well, now once you have those people around you, the next step, remember, preparation, it's you're going to go through scenarios together. It's basically, in the military, it's what we call wargaming. So you just think about, hey, what if this happened? What if this happens? And you basically want the guys around you and girls around you to challenge you, to be the devil's advocate, right? So you need to be able to have an environment where you encourage dissent. And when you do so, you're basically, when you're going through all these scenarios, you're basically considering two aspects. It's like, how likely is it that something happened? And how bad is it when that's going to happen? Probability, severity. For instance, for us, if you're going to deploy for 4 to 5 months to Afghanistan with about 100 people, I can tell you the probability that there's going to be divorces in the detachment, meaning like people deployed in Afghanistan and wives or husbands leaving them while they're deployed, it is just going to happen statistically. So you have to think about that. How are we going to react? Are we going to send the people home? Is that possible? Yes, no, etc. So that's something that was very likely. Now, something that's very severe in our case, that's an aircraft crash, right? So in that case, you go really, really into detail about how we're going to handle that. For us, that means we document procedure. If it's, the divorce, I'll probably just make a mental note on how I would react. But if it's a crash, there's no way I can rely on just a mental note. We're going to have emergency response procedures that are super detailed documents. They're going to say, okay, if this happened, who are we going to contact? We're going to set up a crisis management cell. Who's going to be in it? How are we going to contact emergency services? How are we going to contact next of kin? What is going to be your messaging, etc., etc. And finally, we practice. We just go through, for instance, in the case of a crash, we go to post-crash management exercise. Just tabletop exercises, but we'll just go through all the motions to make sure that our procedures are up to date and that we're nicely synchronized with everybody that's involved. In the military, there's a saying that you train like you fight, or sometimes we say you fight like you train, meaning that, it's really all the preparation is going to pay off when, it hits the fan. So that's before things go bad. Now, when you're in the situation, well, first of all, if you have no time, I really hope you prepared before and that you have your procedures ready so that you can go through them step by step, because that's your only hope now. However, if you have a little bit of time available, maybe you have, you need to fire somebody or there's major layoffs, and you have maybe a couple of days, you want to set a timeline. You want to really put it in different blocks. If you have the option, first of all, you want to give yourself 24 hours so that emotions fade out. Then you want to give yourself maybe a block where you're going to collect data. And you're just doing that. You collect the facts. When time's up, you move into the next block, which is going to be the wargaming, where you're going to take the advice of the people you trust and you're going to consider all the consequences of your action. But also there, you set a stop, and then you transition in the next block, which is going to be reflection. Because at the end, you're the leader, the buck stops with you, you're going to be the one taking the decision. So now you need some time to think, and now you're going to decide and act. And while you're doing this whole process, it is critical that you deep down accept the fact that you will also make mistakes, and that's okay. If you don't, you'll have decision paralysis. It's okay if you make a mistake as a leader. You'll debrief to it, and we'll move forward.
Steph, if I can jump in there, because we spoke about this during the preparation, that in business you often see leaders make a mistake in crises, and then people sort of start to, instead of focusing on the crisis, be it a cybersecurity attack, I've seen there a fatality on a construction site, I've seen it there in those types of crises, then they start turning inwards towards each other, discussing who did what, why, when, and what went wrong. And then you said something very interesting about seeing this with young pilots and the ability to, in a crisis, let go of the mistake that you made. Can you speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, this is something we as pilots train to, is that you need to be very resilient, because the plane just keeps moving. You got to go along with it. And, you know, we constantly make minor mistakes. But if you want to remain performant, you have to really compartmentalize, like, okay, there's only one thing right now that's important, and it's the task at hand. The mistake I just did 30 seconds ago is now irrelevant. I will debrief to it when I get back on the ground, basically when the situation calmed down, when after the crisis, not in the moment. Does that answer the question, Sabine?
Yes, and you also said that you saw that in young pilots when you train them, that they get stuck while flying.
Absolutely. It's something we train. It's a skill we develop in young pilots. Absolutely. Yeah. So going back to point 2, so you set that timeline, and then 1.3 would be, at some point, decisions are, you will have to face tough decisions. So when you do, you have to go back to your why. Your why is your vision statement, your mission statement, and your values. Because those are going to be your lighthouses in the mist. That's what's going to guide you. And finally, as a leader, this is really the tough part, I would say, is you have to be the rock in the storm. All right. People will be looking at you in times of crisis, and whatever energy you're radiating, they're just going to soak it up. So even if the going is really tough, you have to remain composed. You have to remain positive. That doesn't mean you cannot be honest. If the situation is shit, you have to call it like it is. But at least you always keep a positive outlook of where we're heading. And having an inner calm, super important.
In my experience, Steph, that what I see in business is that leaders are often not aware of how they come across, mind you, not only leaders, all of us, unless we do some work around that. We often don't realize how nervous we look, or how angry we look, or how absorbed in something else we look, while people are hoping that we listen to them. So there's definitely some training to do around that. How did you get training around that, or how did you get to where you needed to be on what you display?
Unfortunately, I did not. When I went through my training, it's not really something that was focused on, but it is now.
Okay.
Young pilots now they go through a course which is very close to HeartMath. It's called Technique d'optimisation de performance. Sorry, it comes from France, but it basically means it's stress management techniques which they go through. breathing exercises, etc. Which brings me to this slide. Is right now you are in this crisis situation, and this is kind of a weird slide, at least for me, because it's really thinking about body, mind, and spirit. And I think this sounds very fluffy coming from a fighter pilot, but it's essential. Why? Because if you're a leader, you're running a marathon. You are not running a sprint, and you need to be able to take care of yourself. You're not going to go the distance otherwise. And so what do I mean with body, mind, and spirit? It's very basic stuff, but if you don't have a correct sleep pattern, if you don't exercise, if you don't pay attention to your nutrition, that's going to have a huge effect when you're under stress. Additionally, body is, I would highly recommend just kind of look up some techniques to master your heart rate, reduce anxiety, or improve focus. And I'm not a subject matter expert on that, but one of the things you may be looking into, Googling, is one of the techniques as applied by the Navy SEALs, which is called the 4-second box breathing technique. Super simple, very effective. You just kind of look it up. Mind. What do I mean with mind is it's try to, this is also a little bit before the crisis hit, try to mentally rehearse and visualize stressful situation. And really, the pilots in the audience will recognize that that's basically what we call chair flying. Basically, you're behind your desk, close your eyes, and you're mentally going through all the processes, all the steps, like, hey, if this happens, how will I feel? What are going to be the steps I'm going to take, etc. And this is going to build confidence and resilience. It really works. It's key to what we do in the fighter business. And finally, spirit. You mentioned it, Sabine. It can sometimes be lonely at the top because the buck does stop with you. And so it's really important to have, if you can, a peer network, or not at least a social network, so that they can absorb a little bit of that stress that you keep inside of you. And finally, remember your values. The stronger your sense of purpose, and the more you're grounded in the values we talked about in part 1, the easier it is going to be to withstand pressure. Does that resonate with you, Sabine?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me take it to the next slide and round off the section with a couple of pieces of advice. And the first would be, build the roof before it rains. So preparation, as Steph has said, is key. It's in the calm moments before a crisis hits that we need to build the systems, the relationships, and the routines that will hold us grounded under pressure. A crisis is not a time to improvise. It's a time in which we activate the things that we've prepared. Unfortunately, again, in business, I often see leaders building the roof in the middle of a crisis. Sometimes it's a reputational crisis they didn't see coming, or a real catastrophe to the business, because they felt that, this whole war gaming, the scenario thing was overkill. So my question to all of you, if you're in a leadership position today, is this. Do you know what the top 1 or 2 crisis scenarios are for your specific business? Do you know? Have you thought about them? They're different depending on your industry and your sector. The first thing is get clear on what they are. And the second question is, are you prepared for them if they had to be happening right now while you're sitting in this webinar? Because you should be. The second thing I want to leave you with is, as Steph said, emotions are bad advisors. It's a mantra for myself when I get frustrated or angry. Emotions are bad advisors. Let emotions dissipate. Steph spoke about 24 hours. The research shows that an emotion usually peaks at about 12 minutes and then dissipate. So if you can leave yourself not to respond for just 20 minutes, take yourself out of the room, go take a deep breath of fresh air outside. Just 20 minutes can make a big difference. So remember, emotions impact your ability to see the bigger picture. They narrow our focus. You start to see things very narrowly and only as you want to see them. So don't make decisions while you're very emotional. And then Steph said it, and I think in business, it's equally as important as it is in the Air Force. Find your wingmen and women before you need them. Don't take decisions alone. When we assess risk cultures in organizations, do you know what the first thing is that we look at? The first question we ask is, are people allowed to take decisions alone? If the answer is yes, which can be, which decisions? Sometimes if people take very impactful decisions alone, it's a huge risk for a company because of various reasons, emotions, because of conflicting interests, because of subjectivity, a myriad of things. So don't take decisions alone. Surround yourself with a few people that, as Steph said, that share your values and that you can trust, but who are different than you. And I can't stress this enough. Bring people who have different backgrounds, different perspectives, and different skill sets, because that will actually strengthen your leadership. The last thing that you need in a crisis is yes men or groupthink, because both of those things are known to increase a company's risk culture significantly. And then the last point before we end is, as Steph said, inner mastery equals outer stability. In times of crisis, Steph said it, people expect a leader that can be their rock in a storm. So first, know yourself. What are your values? What's your mission? What's your leadership legacy? What are your strengths and your weaknesses? And secondly, can you self-manage? Can you self-manage when you're frustrated, angry, sad? And can you self-manage so that you can still lead? And as I always tell my clients, practice these things when you don't need them, so that by the time you really do need them, they are already ingrained and part of your system. Don't practice in a crisis, that's too late. And on that note, we have a couple of minutes left. Do we have any questions on making decisions under pressure, either military or business? In the chat or speaking up, love to hear from you.
Or for that matter, any insight. Like we mentioned, we're by no means the expert. There's, I think, a lot of expertise in the room as well. So if there's anything you want to share, we'd love to hear it.
Pleasure, Alain. Okay.
Shall I move on?
Yes, let's take it to the second last slide for today.
All right. So, well, Sabine, thank you very much for doing this together. And it kind of brings us to the end of our conversation. And, you know, we've got this debriefing culture in the Air Force. So I'm super curious as what are your key takeaways today? Did you have any aha moments? Like, well, that was really insightful, or, you know, before, or sorry, or anything on the other spectrum is like anything you see completely different, or any of the statements we made that you want to challenge? Is please go ahead. Yeah. Type it in the chat. We'd love to hear it, and that's definitely it is a
be prepared. Yeah, one aha moment for me, Steph, while people are typing, was when you told me about letting go of a wrong decision in a crisis, and how you can see a pilot is new when they can't let go of that. That to me was an aha moment that I will take with let go of, of that wrong decision in the moment. Don't cling to it.
So,
Elke, the importance of contingency planning, just culture. Yes. Indeed. Good. Super. Last question, having wingmen. Yes, Jan, I cannot say it enough. Have wingmen, have wingmen.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Good. Last question for you guys. What will you do differently after today's webinar? Jurgen, the root cause analysis. Yeah, absolutely. What will you do differently? We're curious. Anything you're going to do differently. Stop, start, keep doing, or do differently after today. Take the 20 minutes. Yes, Alain. So glad to hear that. Take more time, Gunther. Yes. More reflection on assessing myself as a leader. Mehmet. And be kind to yourself. Don't judge yourself. Assess yourself, but don't judge yourself. Pinpointing my values. Yes.
Yeah, Memo, that hits really close because Mehmet and myself, we know each other for years, and I consider him as a great leader. So thank you very much for sharing that with us, Memo.
Thanks to you. It's my privilege to listen to you and Sabine. Thank you.
Jan, my action plan, which I noted down, make a plan for crisis instead of info in my head only. Plot my network and identify my wingmen. Make a plan for my mind, body, mind, spirit improvement. Lovely to read, Jan. Okay. If there are no more comments, closing slide for us. First and foremost, thank you for being with us today. It's a great pleasure. Thank you, Steph, for doing this with me. It's always interesting to have a conversation with you, and I hope we'll have many more. For myself, on the slide you can see what I do. It was pretty clear. I coach leaders, I coach teams, I help companies through change. What would be most important and lovely for me is if you connect with me on LinkedIn so that I grow my network and you can stay in touch with things that I post. So that's it from my side. Thank you for joining. Steph, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sabine. And for me, I'm a little bit more new to this business, but I also do some leadership mentoring developments. I kind of focus as well on trying to translate military strategies, how they work for corporate success. And obviously the whole just culture, that's a big part of what I do. And so I love the keynote. So you can find me online. Really appreciative of everybody taking the time. And just like Sabine said, if you can think of us, that would be awesome. If you see an opportunity where you believe that we could be of any help to anybody within your network, that would be really awesome.
Super. Thank you very much for joining us. As promised, we will share the recording with all those that registered for the session today, so you will get the presentation and the recording afterwards. And for the rest, I wish you a lovely morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Yep. Sabine,
Goodbye, everyone.
You can leave the chat on, maybe, because there might be a couple of people I haven't seen forever. It was me.